So let me officially welcome everyone, in each and every one of you, to this second meeting of the Milan seminar in the history of modern moral philosophy. This online seminar is part of a larger research project which I'm leading at the University of Milan in collaboration with Michael Walshoff. Although the focus of the project, which is called 18 Ethics, is more specific and is in particular on practical ethics and issues in practical ethics in the 18th century. We thought to be great to have a broader background, and as the one that we can provide and explore in such an online seminar, which focuses in general on modern moral philosophy from, let's say, from the late 17th to the early 19th century, with the main focus on the 18th century. So it's great to have all of you and some of you interested in these topics, and it's particularly great to have such a distinguished guest as we have today. Jacqueline Taylor, professor at the University of San Francisco. She hardly needs an introduction to this audience. She is quite simply one of the leading Hume scholars, and most especially the leading scholars on Hume's moral philosophy. I wouldn't even try to mention her many important publications. I'm just recalling some bibliographical data that everyone here already knows very well. She's the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Hume, and she's more recently edited a very, very nice volume on the Second Inquiry, reading Hume Principles of Morals. Even more importantly, to my mind, my taste, is she's the author of this very, very nice volume, Reflecting Subjects: Passion, Sympathy, and Society in Philosophy, which, although it's rather recent, is almost already a classic in Hume's scholarship, as far as I'm concerned. So we are very, very happy to have you as our guest here today, and I'm very grateful that you were willing to accept our invitation in spite of the hindrances as to the time zone and so on. Without further ado, I would like to give you the word to deliver your talk, which has a title, Human Modesty, Esteem, and Self-esteem, with some insight from Wollstonecraft. So many thanks again, Jacqueline. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Stefano. And I also wanted to congratulate you on the European Research Council grant. I think that sounds like such a wonderful opportunity and such a nice long-term opportunity. And I think that you are in Europe the envy of us in America, in the United States at least, where such funding is becoming increasingly difficult to come by. And I saw that Ruth Boker is here. And as you may know, Ruth has also received an ERC grant, and her project is on British women in moral philosophy. And so I look forward to seeing work from Ruth as well. Well, this is an ongoing project, and it is turning into something larger than I first anticipated, because it turns out that modesty it's a very important concept in the 18th century. So I had a brief foray into Adam Smith, but Adam Smith has a tremendous amount to say. It's quite different from Hume's take and Wollstonecraft's take, but it really deserves attention. And also Sophie de Grouchy is another person. And really, there's just a lot going on with this. And part of my interest is to move away from the kind of contemporary analytic moral accounts of modesty that try to figure out how modesty can be consistent with having a good opinion of oneself. And for the 17th and 18th century philosophers, that is really the wrong take. The right approach is to see that modesty is fundamentally other regarding. It really has to do with how we interact with other people in ways that preserve more equitable relations, sociability, and so on. And so this is with a nod to Stefano's own project that I begin, and this is on the handout, with some brief quotes from Hobbes from chapter 15 of Leviathan, where he says that the ninth law of nature is, quote, that every man acknowledges others for his equal by nature. The breach of this precept is pride. What he means by pride here is taking oneself as superior to others and more worthy to command. And he explicitly references Aristotle's Politics here, where Aristotle, of course, thinks that some men are by nature more worthy to command and others are by nature slaves. Hobbes denies this. And he says, on this ninth law dependeth another, quote, that at the entrance into conditions of peace, no man required to reserve to himself any right which he is not content should be reserved to everyone of the rest. The observers of this 10th law are those that we call modest, and the breakers arrogant men. These laws of nature are the laws that reflect the moral virtues, and Hobbes says they are good and praised as the means of peaceable, sociable, and comfortable living. And again, he rejects the Aristotelian view that the moral virtues are a medium between excess and deficiency. Rather, these moral virtues really just have to depend on the means to make life peaceable and sociable. So I'll begin, I'm going to be reading the paper, begin with Hume's view, and then turn to Wollstonecraft. So both David Hume and Mary Wollstonecraft regard modesty as a virtue important for enhancing human sociability and cultivating a sense of humanity. Both believe that a virtuous modesty reflects a sagacious judgment of one's own abilities and is thus compatible with, in Hume's case, one's having an appropriate sense of pride, and in Wollstonecraft's, one's having a lofty consciousness of one's own dignity. Both thinkers contrast modesty with humility, regarding the latter as the vice of thinking too little of oneself, and that turns out to be very important for both of them. Both also distinguish proper modesty from a sexed form of modesty, typically ascribed to or required of women and girls. These are broad areas of agreement, and I shall give some further details in what follows, but there are not surprisingly areas of disagreement as well as different emphases, and I'll examine these and draw out the implications. My main aim will be to argue that combined, Hume's and Wollstonecraft's views show us that modesty remains an important virtue, one worth championing, for precisely the main reason identified by these two thinkers. Real modesty enhances our others while preserving our own sense of dignity. This view contrasts considerably with contemporary philosophical accounts that fail to distinguish between modesty and humility. So I start with Hume. In his treatise of human nature, Hume aims to valorize pride, both as a dispositional passion, as in having a sense of pride, and in some forms as a virtue worthy of the moral approbation of others. As I've put it elsewhere, Hume seeks to restore the dignity of pride. Pride is what I call a high-value passion in the overall economy of the person-evaluative passions, including positive forms such as respect and esteem, and the negative passions of humility and contempt, as well as the moral sentiments of praise and blame. Pride both benefits the proud person by giving him a sense of confidence and is also pleasurable for him, felt as an enhanced sense of self-worth. In the language of Hume's system of ethics, a well-grounded pride is both useful and agreeable. Yet one person's pride can be problematic for others. For example, observing an excessive display of arrogance or an unwarranted pride. The virtue of modesty thus counters the opposition of men's pride, rendering us more sociable. To appreciate the context in which modesty gets established as a virtue, especially as a requirement for a certain kind of conduct towards others, and how modesty and pride can coexist as elements of someone's character, it'll be worthwhile to set out some of the details of Hume's account of pride, given the largely constructive role that it has for agency and its importance in the social and moral theories set out in books 2 and 3 of the treatise. So Hume begins book 2 of the Passions with the passion of pride, signaling the significance of it in his philosophy. You can see number 2 on the handout. Pride is an indirect passion that arises what Hume calls a double relation of ideas and impressions. One such relation belonging to a pleasurable quality or object, the impression, belonging to the proud person, an idea, and the other consisting in the pleasure of pride itself, a second impression directed at the self, the second idea. I was just going to go over the causes of pride, so I'll just pick up right there. Okay, so the causes of pride are natural. Across time and cultures, human beings will identify certain kinds or features of objects as having a value that elicits pride in their possessor. The categories of causes include qualities of mind, such as the virtues, qualities of body, such as strength, beauty, talents, wealth, power, and external advantages, such as family. There's also, and this turns out to be important, a secondary cause arising from the proud person sympathizing with the positive sentiments or attitudes of others directed towards him and sustaining his pride. Hume notes, while the causes of pride are natural, they're not original, which allows for historical and cultural variability of what we can regard as a cause, arising, for example, from customs or technology. We also find variations in who can take pride in what, which I'll touch on later, just very briefly in this account. Hume also identifies some limitations that specify the conditions for someone to take appropriately in something, such as the object being related to him in the right way. 2 of these limitations have special relevance for us. The first is a publicity condition for the object or quality. Others, or a relevant group of others, must recognize the value of the object as something that can elicit pleasure independently of pride, and also discern that the person does indeed possess the valuable quality. The second limitation concerns general rules that serve both to add an amendment to the publicity condition and also enlarge the system of the indirect passions. So what Hume means here is, based on experience, we find that people are typically proud of something such as their wealth, and we will ascribe pride to that person, the wealthy person, even if they don't themselves actually enjoy or take pride in their riches. And Hume notes that custom carries us beyond the just bounds in our passions as well as in our reasoning. In our reasoning, the general rules turn out to be prejudices, and they need correction by reflection on the evidence and so on. But with the passions, Hume actually regards this the way we're just kind of picking out people as social kinds, ascribing to them kinds of passions based on their social standing, and that actually guides how we respond to other people. So general rules with regard to our passions are a kind of social heuristic, a way of thinking about people that guides our own attitudes as we navigate a world of social relations. And this has relevance for the kind of deference we pay to one another when we behave modestly. The publicity condition also points to the role of sympathy in our shared recognition of value and disvalue, albeit with the variability noted above. Notably, Hume introduces sympathy in the treatise with explicit reference to the passion of pride. While sympathy also serves as a source of various self and other regarding passions and of the moral sentiments, the first introduction of it with respect to pride is another signal regarding the importance of pride in Hume's moral psychology. Readers of Hume are familiar with the importance he places on the principle of sympathy. It refers not to any particular passion, but to a natural disposition we have to enter into and often respond to the passions, sentiments, and opinions of others. Hume sometimes describes sympathy as a kind of psychological contagion whereby we catch the emotions of others, but he also emphasizes that we often imaginatively reconstruct the situation of another such that we come to feel the emotion typical of that situation. And especially though there's a passage on the handout, the minds as mirrors to one another passage, that I think is a great example of what we might think of as a kind of perspective taking, where we take up the other person's situation, respond to it in such a way that we're actually enhancing that emotional experience. So I disagree with the claim that Steve Darwell made in the last session that pride is simply contagion for Hume. Sympathy is simply contagion. Sympathy functions as a secondary cause of pride insofar as others' attitudes of esteem or approbation toward us arising from what they take to be valuable about us when communicated to and sympathetically felt as pleasurable by us can both enhance and sustain our sense of pride. Certain other directed passions and attitudes, including esteem, approval, and admiration, are ways of acknowledging the value of objects related to us and play a crucial role in establishing the proper grounds for pride. If others don't recognize as appropriate that in which we take pride, their disapproval of what they regard as our misplaced pride, with which we in turn sympathize, will shock and undermine the positive sense of our own self-worth. So sustaining a sense of pride requires the positive validation of others. And indeed, the publicity condition that I mentioned, one of the limitations, shows how sympathetic interaction is essential for us coming to at least some kind of shared outlook. These might be subcultural groups within a larger society, but shared attitudes about what has value or disvalue. So I have a little more to say about sympathy, but I'm just going to skip over that in the interest of time. But I did want to just mention that in the inquiry, Hume focuses on a special form of sympathy, which he terms humanity. And the principle of humanity is a special reason-informed and reflective form of sympathy that leads us to focus on certain kinds of traits, virtues and vices, the useful and the pernicious, in a particular way. I take that to be actually a huge improvement in his moral philosophy. Now, our sympathy with the esteem of others, either for those qualities in which we take pride or for pride itself, contributes to sustaining pride and increases its value. So here in this passage, comparing the minds of men as mirrors to one another, Hume details the reverberations of sympathy and how they add depth and complexity to our experience both of pride and our esteem for it. So this is number 3 on the handout. I won't read the passage. It's a beautiful passage, I think, because it really shows what Hume wants to get at by his use of the term reverberation. So just briefly, an observer feels pleasure and esteem when he sympathizes with the pleasure that the rich man gets from his possessions. In turn, the rich man sympathizes with that esteem, which elicits pride in him. The observer's sympathy with the rich man's pride becomes a new foundation for esteem, so that pride itself is recognized as a valuable aspect of character, desirable both for its pleasure and usefulness. Now, while sympathy serves to create or strengthen social bonds, Hume introduces another principle, that of comparison, to which much less attention has been paid. The principle of comparison can make us acutely and affectively aware of our social standing in relation to others by turning from another person to ourselves. We typically experience this awareness through a person-evaluative passion, such as respect, humility, or pride. Together, comparison and sympathy explain how our sense of ourself is susceptible to and informed by others' attitudes towards us. While this dependence on the attitudes of others can be constructive, for example, in sustaining a sense of pride, it can also make us vulnerable to others' attitudes towards us and cause us to feel a sense of inferiority, which Hume terms humility. So the virtue of modesty arises by way of a convention aimed at mitigating feelings of humility and directing blame towards unseemly displays of pride. Modesty has a particular value in creating greater equity and sociability in our relations with one another. So Hume characterizes comparison as giving a kind of cognitive bias to the mind's judgments, because we perceive one thing as it stands in relation to another, rather than perceiving the intrinsic qualities of the object as it is in itself. And his interest lies in comparison and what I'm calling the person-evaluative passions. So he focuses on envy and malice, respect and contempt. So for example, a rich man who's content enough with his lot, comparing his situation with that of his poorer neighbors, feels more intensely his sense of how well off he is. Similarly, another person who has all she needs may nevertheless consider herself as lacking when she compares herself with her more successful neighbor. In Book 2, Hume appeals to comparison to explain the origin of envy, malice, respect, and contempt. In Book 3, the comparison with the overtly proud person elicits humility in the one making the comparison, and so Hume uses that to give an account of modesty. I'm not sure that all these uses of comparison can be made consistent, and to my knowledge, no one has actually tried to pull all this together. I think comparison is really important, and I think it's been overlooked because it really gets to our sense of our fragility of ourselves and the way in which we do have to depend on one another to kind of shore up our sense of self-worth. Martin Hartman and Gerald Postma have perhaps done the most significant work, but it remains to be seen whether it can be made consistent or whether we might need to reconstruct Hume's principle of comparison to explain the various phenomena that he thinks it does. So while sympathy focuses our attention on another, comparison refocuses our attention on ourselves in relation to the other, leading us to feel better or worse about ourselves. We've seen that sympathy can generate esteem for pride and moral approval for the form of pride we recognize as a virtue. Comparison has relevance in identifying excessive pride as a vice, although sympathy also comes into play in generating moral of excessive pride. So how does this work? Hume writes that since these principles of sympathy and comparison are directly contrary, it's worthwhile to consider what general rules we might form. And he gives us here, this is number 4 on the handout, this is Lucretius's example of the shipwreck from On the Order of Things, and for Hume's take on it, but basically the general rules that he derives from the passage show that a distant object has no effect on either comparison or sympathy. In this case, as the shipwreck, as it gets closer, such that we can see there's trouble out there, generates comparison. They are suffering, and I am here safe on the shore, and that's Lucretius's point. But then when the disaster scene draws nearer and we more vividly perceive the terror and suffering of the tragedy befalling others, our sympathy gets elicited. So it really depends on the vivacity, whether it's going to be comparing myself to the other or sympathizing with the other. And together, what Hume is doing in this section is showing how this combination of the two principles work together to create moral norms regarding how we display our pride and the need for modesty. Now, Hume notes that the mind has a stronger propensity to pride than to humility. It's really a kind of a drive that is not the same as self-interest. It's really what can be described as self-liking, but it is a drive that kind of preserves our sense of ourself that's important. So he says nothing invigorates and exalts the mind more than pride and vanity, and we're conscious of a great partiality in our own favor. This means then that it's easy to overestimate our merit or advantages and to display signs of superiority that are disagreeable to others. English, like other languages, has various terms that denote excessive or unwarranted pride, overweening conceit, haughtiness, arrogance. In the inquiry, Hume refers to the pompous declaimer. When somebody enters sympathetically into the exalted sentiments of the proud person, a full sympathy would need to observe the connection between the person's pride and the merit or advantage that they possess that is the grounds of pride, and that would result in esteem. But with excessive or unwarranted pride, sympathy gets blocked if the person observes no evident or not enough signs of the merit or advantage. The blocked sympathy gives way to comparison, and the person who's doing the comparing still has this vivid idea of his sense of superiority, and it elicits in her a sense of humility. So the idea still affects her, even though she, at the same time, there's no grounds for the pride. So moral observers sympathize with humility and feel her intense uneasiness, and their sympathetic uneasiness gets directed as a sentiment of disapproval towards the person and his expression of pride and haughtiness. And Hume describes this as another instance of the double rebound of sympathy that we saw in the Minds as Mirrors passage, this time establishing our shared sense that arrogant displays of pride are blameworthy, and reflecting our general sympathetic sensitivity to the painful feelings of others elicited by arrogance. So excessive pride is disagreeable to others and therefore a vice. Hume notes that just as we establish the laws of nature in order to prevent the opposition of self-interest, we establish the rules of good breeding in order to prevent the opposition of men's pride. And we establish it as a general rule that everyone should really tamp down their sense of pride in their outward display. His discussion is nuanced. While we the appearance of modesty, carrying a fair outside, we need not actually undervalue ourselves or feel humility. As he insists in the inquiry, submitting to base servility or degrading oneself constitutes the vice of meanness. So a sense of pride with respect to one's personal merit reflects the confidence one has in one's own moral competence. So a well-concealed and well-founded pride is an essential component and estimable in the character of the man of honor, but decency requires that we conceal this self-partiality, giving others their due recognition. Modesty enjoins us to show mutual deference to one another and to pay one another a due attention and regard. So both modesty and proper pride are virtues. Hume ties modest conduct to our recognition of one another's social station. The notion of social rank or status is often tied to wealth or power. And so number 5 on the handout is a description, Hume thinks, of how we recognize people in terms of their social standing and pay one another these mutual deferences. But his notion of social station is broad. He says at one point, our rank and station in the world can be fixed by birth and fortune, but also by employments, talents, or reputation. So social station is not restricted to socioeconomic status. And I think that's important. And I know Donald Ainsley is working on an account of social station regarding the virtues and vices. And it just adds further nuance into the way in which we value and estimate the sense in which people have moral characters. Number 6 on the handout is another. This is an example of how we have to have this fair outside, even though our internal circumstances, this is especially in hierarchical societies or situations where recognition of the top dog in the room is important, but your internal sentiments are regulated by the real characters of the people you're interacting with. Now, Hume wants to avoid associating modest conduct with a sense of humility. That's a kind of self-debasement or undervaluing oneself. So he suggests that a fair outside is all that is required. This makes it sound as if we are insincere in our modesty. But I think that we should see that sometimes modesty involves just going through the motions, just being polite. But modesty enacted includes a regard for the rules that show one to be disposed to sociability. It might also include an awareness of our shared vulnerability, the fragility of a sense of self that can be undermined by another's contempt or insult or attempt to dominate. The inquiry is particularly helpful on this point. Their pride is equated with dignity, generosity, nobility, and a proper self-valuing. We should strive to cultivate true pride for ourselves, and we expect others to cultivate a well-founded sense of self-value for themselves as well. We might thus think that our modest conduct can express our goodwill towards others, an awareness that self-esteem is a valuable good, but sometimes fragile given the threats to which it is subject. It is in keeping with Hume's discussion to note also that we may sometimes respond to excessive pride with resentment rather than humility. Statements such as, "Who does he think he is?" point to this kind of response when we compare ourselves to the arrogant person. I think a demand for modesty will still be the solution here, with sympathetic observers feeling an indignation that becomes blame of the arrogance. So both humility and resentment point to the proud person's insensitivity to the effect his conduct has on others. Having a sentiment of conscious worth, such that one is ready to resent ill treatment by someone attempting to dominate oneself or others. I'm going to end the section on Hume here. I have other things to say, but I'm going to turn to Wollstonecraft, and we can see how this might dovetail with Hume's approach. So modesty is the only virtue to which Wollstonecraft devotes a chapter of her vindication of the rights of women. Her aim in the chapter is twofold. First, to provide criticism of the notion of modesty as a sexed virtue, required along with chastity only of women, and second, to champion a different notion of modesty as a kind of intellectual virtue connected with good judgment and developed capacities for discernment and reflection. In her dedicatory letter, I'm just going to set out some context for this twofold aim of the vindication, which is written to Monsieur Talleyrand Périgord, congratulating him on the success of the giving rights to men. Wollstonecraft asserts that she is contending for the rights of woman. If woman does not receive an education to prepare her to be the companion of man, she'll stop the progress of truth and virtue, for truth must be common to all in order to be efficacious in the practice of the world. Women's disorderly education creates false associations of ideas that they internalize that keep them weak in both body and mind. A proper education and the acquisition of knowledge is essential for women to achieve independence of thought and judgment, which will then make possible the cultivation of their real constitution. So Wollstonecraft is a perfectionist about human nature. She thinks that human nature, there is a real constitution that requires reason and knowledge and virtue to actually be realized. She has a broader interest, of course, in the condition of society. Vindication. She looks at various hierarchies, that of the military, that of the subject to a monarch and an absolute monarchy, and the clergy. All of these hierarchies require obedience and keep people ignorant of their own abilities. The discussion is very evocative of Kant's "What is enlightenment?" People remaining obedient and immature. Institutions such as the monarchy or the military or the clergy can be reformed and even overthrown, as the French Revolution had shown. And Wollstonecraft is interested in a broader effect in British society, especially establishing a more rigorous system of coeducation and moral education. Social reforms should be founded on our original constitution, which comprises reason and the capacity to acquire knowledge, the tutoring of sensibility and alliance with reason, and our eventual development into more mature beings. So I have the questions that she asks that make reason, virtue, and experience and knowledge, things that all people should have access to. It's number 7 on the handout. And in this context, modesty is the fruit of both reason and sensibility, allowing for a discerning and reflective judgment, and is a hallmark of the mature individual. The special circumstances of women's education that makes reform in this area more difficult comprise the sex norms for females that operate for the most part outside of institutions and impose restrictions on girls at an early age so that their ductile understandings have little chance of developing beyond what they are taught. While the laws disenfranchise women, depriving them of many rights, Wollstonecraft turns a more critical eye on the guidebooks, the many guidebooks that were abundant, giving what she thinks as false views of how women and girls should be educated. So she engages in conversation here with James Fordyce, John Gregory, and particularly Jean-Jacques Rousseau. According to these male authors, women naturally lack strength of mind. For Wollstonecraft, this impoverished education for women that they attends to manners above morals, to the most superficial aspects of their person, creating the sexed minds and bodies of women. Well, she makes it clear that the convention establishing sex-based norms for modest women exerts a genuine influence on how women regard themselves, their beliefs and feelings about themselves, as well as their typical demeanor. She sets out in chapter 6 of the Vindication this account of women's education in terms of the association of ideas. And what she wants to show here is that so she is a believer in association of ideas, as is Hume, but she's drawing more on Hartley and on Richard Price's idea of association, and how it actually affects posture, bearing, movement, as well as the beliefs one has about oneself, how one feels and expresses emotions. So number 8 on the handout, with their weaker minds, women lack knowledge and mental ability to efface what she calls the superinductions of art that have smothered nature. So superinduction is not a word we use anymore, but it was common in the 17th and 18th century, and it refers to something that's brought out in addition to or above a person's original nature, displace that original nature. And that's what she thinks superinductions are doing in the case of women, blocking their original constitution and creating something artificial. As she puts it, a sexual character is given and not original to the mind. Now, she devotes chapter 7 of the Vindication to the concept of modesty. And she wants to consider it comprehensively, not as a sexual virtue. The modesty that she regards as a virtue is the offspring of sensibility and reason, requiring reason improved by intellectual pursuits and the acquisition of knowledge, as well as an ambition to implement plans that result in usefulness to society. This true form of modesty is a genuine natural virtue, one that requires effort to cultivate. So it stands in stark contrast to the habitual sexual modesty that make women ignorant and the slaves of sensibility. And she has a lot of criticism here of the concept of gallantry that we'll just set aside, but true modesty is not a sex trait. It's something that both men and women should cultivate. She likewise advocates for a shared chastity between men and women that is far from lust and what she calls a rustic shyness, in favor of a decency that will eliminate the kind of warfare between the sexes that male gallantry and female mock modesty create, a war that women lose since sexual modesty shoulders them with the greater burden, but without the strength of mind to resist the charms of the gallant. Modesty as a virtue is consistent then with a lofty consciousness of one's own dignity. It reflects a judicious sense of oneself and one's capabilities, rather than thinking too highly of oneself or having a low self-regard. That's number 9 on the handout. She contrasts modesty with other forms of self-regard, deficiencies such as humility, bashfulness, and also with the excess of vanity, a sense that one is superior to others. Modesty enjoins proper respect for oneself and is also an other regarding virtue. The person who neither debases herself nor presumes superiority above others has a heart that isn't narrowed by selfishness, but instead cultivates fellow feeling and respect for humanity. This respect for man, as she puts it, is the foundation of every noble sentiment. It's not mere propriety, an outward show based on social expectations and respect for opinion. She says, God requires more than modesty of mien. We may see her here as either disagreeing with Hume, that modesty is merely a fair outside, or providing him with a solution to the threat of hypocrisy. If false associations shape body and mind, then true associations that lead to the knowledge, education, experience, proper experience and virtue, and eventually to maturity and modesty, then those associations will be built into not only how one conducts oneself physically, but the fabric of the character. And I think that this would actually should be amenable to the Humean position, since modest conduct, even though it sometimes is just going through the motions, it does involve us behaving in such a way that is part of actually who we are. So for Wollstonecraft, as well as Hume, modesty is consistent not only with one's sense of dignity, but also with ambition. So it's not a downplaying of oneself and one's abilities. Her example of the modest person is General George Washington. As she notes, the modest person will be aware of her own strengths and capacities for great plans that she can successfully realize. Her steadiness contrasts with the timidity of the person of humility. Modesty makes possible and will be sustained by successful intellectual pursuits, as well as humane practical plans and the exercise of real affection. So there's more to say, but I'm just going to wrap up here. And again, just point out, I think that one of the most important differences between Hume and Wollstonecraft is that for Wollstonecraft, modesty reflects maturity and the perfection of our nature. But for both her and Hume, it aims at strengthening self-worth and showing a due regard for the worth of others. Thank you.